Daniel and Emily first crossed paths during a church event in their East Coast city. They quickly discovered they had a lot in common: a shared love for the beach, movies, professional sports, running, volleyball, and lively parties. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like the perfect couple. Their relationship officially began during a volleyball tournament, a twist of fate brought on when Dan's friend Nathan, originally Emily's partner, had to back out at the last minute. Nathan called to inform them, "I can't make it. You two should team up for the tournament." Without hesitation, they agreed and spent some time practicing together beforehand. Emily played with fierce determination, diving fearlessly for the ball and setting it up like a pro. Dan, tall and powerfully built, unleashed thunderous spikes. On the court, their partnership was seamless, and together, they clinched the tournament win. The night ended in celebration at a local bar with other players. Emily's subtle touches throughout the evening left Dan mesmerized. Her beauty and confident demeanor captivated him completely. Later that night, they found themselves at her apartment. She kicked off her shoes, sunk into the sofa with a sigh, and gestured for him to join her. "Wow, what a day," she said, her voice soft and reflective. "This means a lot to me too," Dan replied, sitting down beside her. "When Nathan dropped out, I thought we were doomed. Honestly, when he introduced us, I thought you were cute, but I didn't expect us to win." "Well, we did," Emily said, flashing a triumphant smile. "And you're pretty incredible at volleyball yourself. Do you really think I'm cute?" Dan chuckled. "Something like that. Today felt surreal. Winning and celebrating with you made it unforgettable. I really like you." He leaned over and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Unreal," he murmured. "Who would have thought a friend asking me to team up with someone so beautiful would lead to this? You're not just gorgeous, you're amazing at volleyball too." Emily's laughter filled the room. "It really was a great day," she said, leaning in closer. "Do you still feel dizzy and out of breath?" Dan nodded. "Yeah, a little." With a playful smirk, she moved nearer, her face inches from his, and traced her hand along his thigh. "How about now? Does this help?" "Not really," he admitted, his voice shaky. She slid her hand up to his waist, and his breath hitched. "That just adds a whole new layer I can't even explain." Emily locked eyes with him and grinned. "This forces me." "What does?" Dan asked, intrigued. "It forces me to focus on how much you turn me on rather than how good you are at volleyball," she teased. Dan smirked. "I've got more than just volleyball skills, you know." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Skills are the last thing on my mind right now." She leaned in and kissed him deeply. Her lips were soft, and her tongue explored his, leaving him breathless. When they finally broke apart, Emily's sparkling eyes met his. "Why are you smiling?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "I'm just amazed," Dan replied, his gaze trailing over her face. "Your perfect lips, your delicate eyelashes, those cute freckles. You're stunning, Emily." She blushed and murmured, "This is overwhelming." A tear slid down her cheek before she kissed him again, this time with more intensity. Her hand moved boldly to the front of his shorts, testing his reaction. "I want to see how much more I can make you feel," she whispered, pulling him toward her bedroom. As the night unfolded, Emily confidently took charge, peeling away her layers one by one and reveling in his captivated gaze. Their chemistry ignited something electric between them. That night, she thought to herself, "He's perfect." After dating for over a year, their love story blossomed. They chose a dreamy Caribbean island as the setting for their wedding, sealing their vows with promises of unity and devotion. Their physical connection remained strong, though Emily's insatiable energy sometimes left Dan struggling to keep up. They bought a charming old house in an ideal location and wasted no time christening every room, and even the backyard under the stars. Their shared love for fitness kept them in peak condition. Dan, once approached for modeling, had a chiseled physique, while Emily, with her flawless skin and athletic build, could have easily graced the cover of a magazine. She stayed curvy and toned, balancing strength with elegance. Their careers, Dan in software development and Emily in technical equipment sales, were equally impressive. Both were highly regarded in their fields, and together, they earned a comfortable living. Despite their busy lives, they found time for hobbies. Dan enjoyed mountain biking and photography, while Emily indulged her love for cooking and pop culture trivia. Friends and family marveled at their seemingly perfect relationship, noting how well they complemented each other in every way, even politically. As rare conservative voices in a liberal-leaning city, they stood united on candidates and issues. Whenever a disagreement arose, it was resolved almost instantly, often with amused friends remarking, "They're truly meant for each other." Life seemed idyllic, until one evening, Dan heard Emily's raised voice in their home office and went to investigate. After Emily explained the problem she was facing, Dan quickly devised a small program routine to resolve it. Not only did her work speed up significantly, but the improved software also enhanced productivity for her entire team. Emily was effusive in her gratitude, expressing her thanks both verbally and through affectionate gestures. Her company praised her for the improvement, while Dan later adapted the same routine for his own work. Together, they pursued a life of comfort and security, carefully managing their finances to enjoy luxuries like vacations, upgraded vehicles, and eventually a better home. Emily occasionally earned sizable bonuses for her success on major projects, and they used these windfalls to invest in real estate. With careful planning, they bought and renovated properties, turning them into rental homes. After 7 years, they had 3 houses and a condo in their portfolio. Dan took charge of the renovations and maintenance, installing modern features like electronic locks, security cameras, and fixing up systems like sprinklers, while Emily focused on her growing career. These tasks consumed much of Dan's free time, while Emily worked even longer hours at her company. One Saturday, shortly after their 9th wedding anniversary, Dan had planned to repair the sprinkler system at one of their rental properties. Before he could leave, Emily called out to him, her tone playful yet demanding. "Dan, baby, before you waste time on those water pipes, I need your help with a problem," she teased. "Is there a visible leak?" He yelled back from behind the garage, tools in hand and ready to head to his truck. "Well, not many pipes run through our bedroom ceiling," she called back, her voice carrying a mischievous edge. "You'd better come up and check it out." Setting his tools aside, Dan climbed the stairs and walked into their bedroom. He stopped in his tracks, his jaw dropping at the sight before him. Emily lay sprawled on the bed, wearing nothing but bud clamps and holding a small, buzzing toy. Her knees were bent and spread apart, and her face was flushed with heat. "What the?" Dan blurted, stunned. "Oh, baby," Emily moaned breathlessly. "I think you need to stay home and take care of me right now." Her heavy breathing and sultry expression left Dan speechless. Dropping his car keys, he stripped off his clothes in record time. "Laying pipes can be a very involved process," he murmured, grinning as he climbed into bed. "It takes careful planning, precise measurements, and plenty of attention to detail." That day, Dan never made it to the rental property. Instead, he devoted himself entirely to Emily, their passion overflowing as they shared an afternoon of unrestrained intimacy, culminating in multiple climaxes. The connection between them seemed stronger than ever. They had often discussed starting a family but agreed to wait until their finances were in order. Now, with several properties under their belt and 6-figure bank accounts, Dan was eager to take the next step. Emily, however, wanted to delay a little longer to achieve a few more career milestones and solidify their financial stability. Her recent promotion had filled her with pride. She felt she had finally built a real career, not just a job. On their 10th anniversary, they attended a party with friends and family, themed perfect for each other. They won a cornhole game together and celebrated with a 4-day vineyard tour, complete with rented limousines. Upon returning home, their anniversary festivities continued as they shed their clothes and made love in the living room, on the stairs, and in the bedroom. Life was good. By all appearances, they truly were perfect for each other. Emily's promotion to Director of Divisional Services was a milestone, and she was elated to share the news with Dan. They celebrated with dinner at La Pomade and continued the celebration at home. At work, she met Eric Bradley, the new Director of New Accounts. Tall, charming, and impeccably dressed, Eric quickly became a favorite among the women in the office, thanks to his flirtatious charm and easy smile. Despite a company culture that discouraged office romances between employees of different ranks, There was no prohibition against relationships between colleagues of equal standing. Eric took an immediate interest in Emily. Damn, he thought. She's one hell of a gorgeous woman. Learning of her perfect marriage only intrigued him further. He was convinced no marriage was without room for adventure. Over the following months, Eric made an effort to get to know Emily better. They often had lunch to discuss work, during which Eric subtly flattered her achievements and made her feel valued. He even researched Dan's profession and Emily's favorite activities, foods, and places, using this knowledge to strengthen their rapport. Eric's charm and attentiveness made Emily feel noticed and appreciated, particularly as he ensured her contributions were recognized during meetings and projects. Their company's new focus on New York accounts meant Emily often traveled for client meetings. Eric, always attentive, made sure she experienced the city's finest restaurants and most exciting events, further solidifying their connection. Meanwhile, Dan began to notice changes in their relationship. Their intimacy had become less frequent, and when he tried to discuss their dynamic, Emily often deflected, citing stress and long hours at work. To make amends, she planned a surprise for their upcoming anniversary, a September trip to Italy, a place Dan had always dreamed of visiting. When she shared the news in May, they celebrated with a day spent in bed, poring over travel guides and planning their itinerary. However, a few weeks later, Emily's company scheduled an executive retreat in Miami for July. Over dinner, she made a decision she hoped Dan would understand, and she prepared to tell him about it. Dan, honey, I've got some good news and some bad news. Which do you want first? Emily asked, her tone light but cautious. Just lay it on me, baby, Dan replied, not bothering to pick a side. Okay, I've decided to reschedule our September trip to Italy. Instead, we're going to Miami in July. It'll save us money, which is great for growing our family. Emily delivered the news quickly, hoping to soften the blow. Dan stared at her in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he said, I thought you were heading to Miami in July for an executive retreat. How does that fit in? It's perfect for us, Emily said, her enthusiasm unwavering. The company's paying for the hotel during the week, so we save a ton. Miami's a party town with amazing beaches, restaurants, and nightlife. I bet we can even play some volleyball on the sand. Dan frowned. But if you're working, how are we supposed to enjoy all that together? The work sessions will be done by lunchtime every day, Emily assured him. We can stay through the following weekend to spend some quality time together. Dan sighed. I think we've got enough saved to enjoy both trips, and honestly, I've been looking forward to Italy for a long time. Miami sounds great, but I don't see why we have to cancel. Emily shrugged, brushing off his concern. I've already canceled the September tickets. We'll plan Italy for another time. Let's focus on making Miami fun. Despite further discussion, Emily didn't budge. Resigned, Dan decided to make the best of it. He booked a dinner reservation at a high-end restaurant and started researching volleyball tournaments happening during their trip. In the weeks leading up to Miami, Emily traveled again to New York for work. When Dan asked about her evenings there, she gave her usual vague answers, business dinners or late meetings with clients. By the time they arrived in Miami on a sunny Sunday afternoon, Dan had cautiously adjusted his expectations. They checked into their hotel, spent some time on the beach, and even joined a couple of volleyball matches, rekindling memories of their early days. That evening was the company's welcome event, and Emily managed to get permission for Dan to attend. At the dinner party, Dan noticed Emily spending more time than he liked with Eric. Feeling uneasy, he suggested she stay close to him or call it a night. Emily brushed him off, insisting it was all work-related. Don't make a scene, Dan, she said firmly. This is important for my career. Dan lingered nearby, watching the interaction between Emily and Eric. Hannah, the CEO, caught sight of him and struck up a conversation. She was intrigued by Dan's technical background and, after a few drinks, grew overly flirtatious. She lightly ran her finger along his arm and even grabbed his wrist, but Dan politely made his disinterest clear and excused himself to the restroom. Hannah's face burned with embarrassment, and her mood soured. Later, when the event ended, Dan persuaded Emily to join him at the hotel bar for a private drink, but their time together was cut short when Eric arrived. Exhausted, Emily called it a night, and fell asleep almost immediately after they returned to their room. The week unfolded much as Dan had feared. Emily's work commitments ran late, often until 5 p.m., and several evenings were occupied by executive-only events. Dan found himself spending hours waiting in the hotel hallway or passing time alone on the beach. Although there were plenty of attractive women around, they didn't hold his interest. His attention was focused on the wife, who seemed increasingly distant. Meanwhile, Hannah's resentment over Dan's rejection simmered. She began to chime in with Eric's disparaging remarks about non-executive employees and even used Dan as an example during a hiring discussion, calling him a worker bee compared to the company's upper management. By the end of the trip, Dan was deeply disappointed. Even the weekend wasn't much of a celebration. They made love only a handful of times, and the emotional connection felt strained. For Emily, however, Miami had been a success. She returned home energized by the experience and excited about her role in the company. Life resumed its usual pattern when they got back. Dan stayed busy with work and home projects, while Emily's frequent trips to New York left him feeling increasingly like a background character in her life. Whenever he pressed her for details about her travels, her responses were short and rehearsed. In mid-September, Dan tried once again to broach the topic. "Jess, until this year, I never realized how focused your company is on New York. What's changed?" "You're right," Emily admitted, sipping her wine. "It wasn't like this before, but we're growing fast. Concentrating on one region helps us handle multiple clients efficiently. It's just part of the company's strategy." Dan frowned. "Why are you so involved in sales now? That wasn't your job before." "Hannah's idea," Emily explained. "She thinks having someone from post-sales in the room during negotiations increases the chances of closing deals. And she's not wrong. It's working. This is all part of a year-long push. Things will calm down once we hit our targets." She reassured him that her travel schedule would ease up after October, but Dan wasn't convinced. Their physical intimacy had dwindled to a mere 4 times a month, and their connection felt more like that of roommates than a married couple. Still, he hoped they could find their way back to each other once the busy season ended. When Emily returned from New York on a Friday evening, Dan welcomed her home with grilled steak and her favorite wine. She greeted him with a brief hug and kiss, and they sat down to dinner. "Thank you for this wonderful meal," she said, raising her glass. "It feels like a little holiday." "Baby, I'm just glad you'll be home for the next week," Dan said, his voice warm with hope. "We could use some time to relax." Emily hesitated before responding. "It'll be a short break, honey. I need to fly back to New York on Saturday evening." Dan froze, the smile fading from his face. "Tomorrow? I thought you'd be home all next week. What about the weekend?" "I'm sorry," Emily said, her tone firm and unyielding. "This is just how things have to be right now." Dan stood and silently began clearing the table. Emily watched him from her seat, her posture commanding and detached as she sipped her wine, unfazed by his quiet frustration. They barely exchanged words as Dan methodically cleaned up after dinner. Frustrated and sensing the evening was a lost cause, he retreated to the laundry room and began sorting clothes. After a moment, he called out, "Do you have anything I can wash before you leave, Jess?" "No, that's not necessary, Dan," she replied from the other room. "Everything is clean. You just got back." "Isn't it expensive to do laundry at the hotel?" Dan asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Does your company cover that?" "No, I didn't do it at the hotel," Emily admitted, her tone casual. "I did it at Eric's apartment." Dan froze, the weight of her words sinking in. "What? Why?" he managed to ask, his mind racing. "Is that where you've been staying the last couple of times you went to New York?" Emily met his shocked expression with surprising calm. "Yes. It wasn't about saving money, Dan. It's more than that." "Then why?" Dan asked, his voice rising with disbelief. "What's going on? Why would you stay with him?" Emily took a deep breath, her expression hardening. "Dan, there are things in my life that need to change. I'm approaching 40, and when I look back, I want to see a life filled with certain experiences. If things stay the way they are now, I'll never have that." Dan stood there, stunned, as she continued. "These past few trips to New York have been eye-opening for me. I'm working as an executive director now, collaborating with other top managers. After work, Eric and I go to Broadway shows or visit the Met. We dine at elegant places like the Rainbow Room or Peter Luger. He dresses impeccably, treats me like royalty, and makes me feel special. Dan's heart sank as her words hit him like a freight train. So that's it? You want a life that doesn't include me because I don't fit into your picture-perfect fantasy? Emily's voice grew cold. Dan, you're a good man. We've had great times. But you're not the kind of man who can give me the life I want. You'll always be content being a service provider, fixing sprinklers and installing locks. You're not a leader, and you never will be. I've outgrown this. But we talked about having kids, about building a future together, Dan said, his voice cracking with emotion. Emily shook her head. Dan, my body isn't slowing down for children. It's not happening. Dan's frustration boiled over. Damn it, Jess. Did you sleep with him? Is that what this is about? You have no right to ask me that. Emily snapped, her voice sharp and defiant. I'm your husband, Dan shouted. The man you married and said you loved. I have every right to ask. This is my body, Dan, she spat. I can sleep with whoever I want. If I wanted to sleep with the entire New York Giants football team, it's none of your business. Honestly, I don't think I ever truly loved you. Marrying you was a mistake, and you need to grow up and accept that. I'm filing for divorce. And stop calling me baby. It's not appropriate anymore. Dan stood there, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger and despair. He wanted to lash out, to scream, to make her see how cruel she was being. Let me get this straight, he said, fighting to keep his composure. You're divorcing me because you've decided someone else is better for you? Emily sighed. I guess that's a fair summary. Dan, we're just different people. We always were. I didn't realize it until now. And you're getting this from Eric? From the people you work with? Dan asked, incredulous. It's not just Eric, Emily replied sharply. Others see it too. Hannah, Sophie, even some of the other directors. They understand where I'm coming from. Dan let out a bitter laugh. Hannah? I thought she liked me. So, your little executive circle has decided I'm beneath you. Got it. Fine. Are you taking the guest room, or am I? Emily's tone was ice cold. I think it's best if you take the guest room. We shouldn't share a bed anymore. Dan nodded, his face grim. You're right about that. I'll take the guest room. He left the room, gathering his things in silence. That night, while Emily was asleep, Dan began researching family lawyers. A few days later, he met with Catherine, an attorney with a no-nonsense demeanor and sharp, sparkling eyes. How can I help you, Daniel? She asked, her tone professional but kind. Call me Dan, he replied. And you can call me Kate if that feels more comfortable. I need help with a divorce. Kate listened as Dan laid out the situation. She explained the legal process, warning him about potential complications and asking whether reconciliation was an option. Dan shook his head. It was clear there was no going back. Kate handed him a list of tasks to start disentangling their shared finances and property. Together, they worked out a fair division of assets, including their houses. Dan began notifying friends and family about the divorce. The news prompted an angry call from Emily, who was still in New York. You're an idiot, she shouted. Who gave you the right to tell everyone about our divorce? You did, Dan replied evenly. When? Emily demanded. When you said you were divorcing me and that you'd rather spend your life with Eric, Dan reminded her. Emily fumed. I expected we'd tell people casually at family events, not make some big announcement. I didn't give you permission to do that. Dan's confusion was palpable. What's wrong with the way I said it? Emily read aloud from the note she'd received from her sister. Unfortunately, I have to announce that Jess has chosen to neglect her wedding vows and pursue a relationship with someone from her company who seduced her. We will not be able to attend social events or otherwise participate in our former relationship with you as a loving couple. Please respect the sensitivity of our situation and allow us to end our marriage as quickly as possible. Emily's face flushed with irritation as she looked up from the note. What's wrong with this, Dan? It paints me like a fool who was manipulated by some smarter, more powerful man, she said, exasperated. Dan shrugged, his tone calm but firm. I stand by it, Jess. You wanted a divorce, and I wouldn't stay married to you no matter how much I loved you a week ago. You even said it yourself. It's inappropriate to stay with someone who's openly admitted to being unfaithful. He paused before continuing, his words cutting. By the way, I've already been tested for STDs and am waiting for the results. I suggest you do the same. If Eric was willing to sleep with you while you were married to me, who knows how many other people he's been with? Emily's face hardened, her frustration bubbling over. You're unbelievable, she shouted before ending the call and nearly slamming her phone down on the table. Dan felt a grim sense of satisfaction but still couldn't sleep that night. His mind was flooded with memories of the life they'd once shared. The trips, the intimate moments, the laughter and love. Now, it all seemed hollow, a cruel joke. Even food had lost its taste as the reality of their unraveling relationship set in. Their lawyers handled the divorce proceedings efficiently. Retirement accounts and cash were separated, credit cards were canceled and reissued individually, and properties were divided. Dan chose not to keep the house they lived in during their happiest years. It felt like a monument to something that no longer existed. Emily got the house, fitting her new self-image as a sophisticated executive, while Dan moved into an apartment closer to the city center. 2 months after Emily announced her need for change, they barely spoke except when necessary for legal matters. Occasionally, they saw each other at church or mutual social events. At one such gathering, Emily brought Eric along and insisted on introducing him to Dan. Eric extended his hand with a smug grin. I've heard a lot about you, Dan. Dan stared at him, his expression unreadable. I wish I'd known where this was heading when I first met you in Miami, he said coldly. Then, with a glance at Emily and a shake of his head, he turned and walked away. As time went on, Dan reevaluated his social circle. He divided their mutual friends into 2 groups, those he could trust and those who might report back to Emily. For the latter, he maintained polite but distant relationships, keeping his thoughts and emotions guarded. Neil Sedaka was right, Dan thought bitterly. Breaking up really is hard to do. At work, his friends rallied around him. His boss, Jacob, called him into his office one afternoon. Dan, if you need anything, just let me know. I know this must be incredibly difficult. If you ever need time off or someone to talk to, my door's open. Dan nodded, grateful. Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate your support. It's tough trying to manage everything, but I'm figuring it out. Jacob leaned forward, his tone serious. Dan, I need to say this, don't let thoughts of revenge lead you to do something you'll regret. Trust me, a few minutes of satisfaction isn't worth years of legal headaches. Stay smart. Dan chuckled darkly. Sounds like you're speaking from experience. Jacob smirked. Maybe. If you're thinking about revenge, think of it like a programming problem. Define your parameters. No violence, no illegal actions. Then identify areas where you could strike. Social, financial, professional. Be creative. Like you were in your work. Dan left Jacob's office with a lot on his mind. He got permission to use the conference room after hours and began brainstorming. With the help of a few trusted friends, he created a list of revenge categories: social, financial, professional, self-esteem, legal, physical, and technical. They filled the whiteboard with ideas, some practical, others wild. By the end of the session, Dan took a photo of the board, boxed it up, and tucked it away in the closet. Later, Jacob called to check in. Dan, I hope you're feeling a bit better. Just remember to keep brainstorming sessions outside of work hours. Dan laughed lightly. Thanks for the reminder, Jacob, and for your patience. I'll keep it in check. A few days later, Dan was playing racquetball with a friend from church. Between serves, his friend asked, Are you going to sign up for the annual Church Beach volleyball tournament next month? Dan shrugged. Hadn't really thought about it. My volleyball partner and I, well, we broke up. I know, his friend said sympathetically, but you always enjoy it. Maybe you should join the guys' team or something. Probably not this year, Dan replied. Fair enough. I just saw that Jess signed up and thought of you, his friend continued. She's playing mixed couples. Did you know? Dan nodded. Yeah, I saw her name on the roster. What's the registration deadline again? The friend asked. A week before the tournament, Dan informed him. Thanks for the reminder, his friend said, moving to serve again. That evening, Dan couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. By the time the sun set, he had pulled out his revenge matrix. In the office, he added a new line to the board labeled sports results and began brainstorming. The next day at lunch, he reconvened his revenge team in the conference room, eager to expand on the new idea. Later that evening, he grabbed a drink with an old friend from his university days, discussing strategies over laughter and old memories. The following afternoon, Luke, one of Dan's closest collaborators on the revenge team, came into his office and shut the door behind him. Dan, I've got to ask, how serious are you about going through with this revenge stuff? Luke's tone was cautious but concerned. That's a fair question. Why do you ask? Dan replied. Because some of the stuff on that matrix is just venting, but some of it, well, it could be illegal, like the physical violence column. You're not actually planning anything crazy, right? Luke asked, leaning forward. Dan shook his head. No way. Look, I'll admit there are moments I wouldn't feel bad if Eric just disappeared, but I'd never do anything to make that happen. And I'm done with Jess. I'd never take her back. Not in this life or the next. Good to know, Luke said, relaxing slightly. But still, some of these things could have consequences you haven't thought through. If there's even a shred of you that wants reconciliation, never. Dan cut him off, his voice sharp. Jess spit on my love and trust. She gutted everything I built with her, and for what? To chase some fantasy life with a guy in tailored suits? No, Luke. She needs to feel the consequences of her actions. Luke nodded, his expression serious. All right, but maybe run your ideas by someone with legal experience, just to be safe. I'll think about it, Dan said. Thanks for looking out. Over the next few days, Dan focused on work and slowly got back into volleyball. He found a new teammate, Samantha Sam Collins, and decided to sign up for the tournament. He erased the physical pain line from the matrix and redirected his energy toward more productive outlets. Luke didn't bring up the revenge plan again, and Dan figured it had served its purpose as a mental exercise. The Church Beach volleyball tournament had grown significantly since Dan and Jess won it together a decade ago. Now, it attracted teams from neighboring states and non-churchgoers, evolving into a large, weekend-long outreach event. This year's tournament was no exception, culminating in a Sunday barbecue after the awards ceremony. Dan and Sam made it to the mixed doubles finals, where they faced none other than Jess and Eric. Sam was a striking redhead in her 30s, her green eyes and freckled skin catching everyone's attention. At 6 feet tall, she moved with an elegance and athleticism that captivated the crowd. The pair wore matching three-quarter sleeve shirts, presenting a united front. The finals drew a sizable audience, thanks to rumors of lingering tension between Dan and Jess. Spectators eagerly anticipated fireworks, but the match began with little fanfare, aside from Dan refusing to shake hands with Jess and Eric, citing an arm injury he didn't want to aggravate. The game itself started evenly, but Dan and Sam soon pulled ahead. While Jess and Eric relied on brute strength and speed, Dan and Sam displayed almost poetic coordination, their movements precise and fluid. Sam's ability to leap impossibly high for spikes and blocks left the crowd in awe. In the second game, the tone shifted. About 5 points in, Dan began targeting his opponent's legs with his shots. One particularly deceptive play ended with him slamming the ball directly into Eric's face, sending him sprawling onto the sand. Blood dripped from Eric's nose, and the game paused as he was tended to. Dan returned to a more neutral strategy after that, but the damage was done. He and Sam swept the match in straight sets, 21-4, 21-0. The crowd erupted as the game ended. At the net, Dan extended his hand to Jess for the post-game handshake. "What about your arm?" Jess asked, her voice edged with suspicion. Dan smiled coolly. "It's fine now, ma'am. Good game." Then, leaning in so only she could hear, he added, "You're a team of losers." Jess's eyes narrowed. She yanked her hand away and swung at him in frustration, but Dan dodged effortlessly, his movements as deft as they had been on the court. She glared at him, quickly checking to see if anyone had overheard. Fortunately for her, no one was close enough to catch the exchange. From a distance, many spectators assumed Jess's reaction was one of jealousy or poor sportsmanship, solidifying her image as a sore loser in their eyes. The awards ceremony went off without a hitch, though Jess's frustration became evident when she learned that, for the first time, the perpetual trophy's engraved plaque would include not only the winners' names, but also the losers' names and the final score. The lopsided 21-4, 21-0 result stood as an eternal reminder of the crushing defeat. At the afternoon feast, Nathan approached Sam, curiosity evident in his expression. "You seem familiar. Have we met before?" "I don't think so, Nathan," she replied with a polite smile. "But I hear that a lot." "Sam and I go way back," Dan chimed in. "We were friends in school and played volleyball together. She was always better. She even made it to the Olympics on the U.S. beach volleyball team." Nathan's eyebrows shot up. "Really?" "Yeah, but I had to leave early," Sam added. "An ankle injury cut my time short, but I guess all those televised matches left an impression." "That makes sense now," Nathan said, nodding in recognition. Later that evening, after Dan dropped Sam off at her place, she invited him in for a nightcap. Once she had changed into something comfortable, they settled on her couch with glasses of whiskey. She looked at him, her green eyes sparkling. "Dan, I know this started as a rematch, but during our practices and today's tournament, I realized how much I've enjoyed spending time with you," she said softly. Leaning in, she kissed him, a deep, lingering kiss that ended with her tongue lightly grazing his lips as they parted. When Dan opened his eyes, he found himself mesmerized by her. His gaze traced the graceful lines of her jaw and neck to her collarbone and the soft freckles on her shoulders. When he looked back into her eyes, he saw a glimmer of emotion he hadn't expected. "Sam," he began, "I'd really like to explore a relationship with you, but right now, it feels too much like a reflection of my past. You deserve better than being a part of that story. I want to get to know the Sam you are now." Her smile widened. "That's more than fair, Dan. I don't want to be anyone's reflection either." They finished their drinks and agreed on a date in 3 weeks. After a gentle kiss at her door, Dan walked home, his thoughts lighter than they had been in months. The divorce was final, and Dan and Jess now lived separate lives. They occasionally learned of major events in each other's lives through mutual friends, their shared church, or social circles. At work, Luke asked Dan if he was ready to erase the revenge matrix. Dan shook his head. "I still feel like I haven't resolved 10 years of lies, or 10 years of love that turned out to be worthless." "Okay," Luke said carefully. "I have an idea that's evolved. Let's revisit the matrix, and you can decide how far you want to go." "Curious," Dan agreed. At the next meeting, Luke presented his updated suggestion, which tackled 2 aspects of the same action. One that Dan had already started discussing with Jacob, and a second that was more contentious. The room fell silent as Luke laid out the potential consequences. The team debated the pros and cons before leaving the decision to Dan. Dan took weeks to weigh his options, during which life continued moving forward. Jess became pregnant, living with Eric in the apartment she'd taken after the divorce. When Dan learned the news, he couldn't help but feel a mix of bitterness and relief. One Sunday after church, Dan ran into Jess in the parking lot. "Are you going to congratulate me?" Jess asked with a smirk. Dan raised an eyebrow. "I thought your precious body was too good for bearing children. Or was Eric's top-class seed too strong to resist?" Jess's smile tightened. "It wasn't planned." "How far along are you?" Dan asked bluntly. 7 months, she said. "So, you didn't even wait until the ink was dry on the divorce papers to get pregnant," Dan said with a sneer. Jess shot back, "A top-class seed is a top-class seed." Dan's lip curled. "Funny, because as I recall looking at the trophy this morning, you and Eric are the ones marked as losers. Fitting, don't you think?" Jess's eyes blazed. "And you're nothing but a low-class idiot, a loser who will never amount to anything." Dan shrugged. "Enjoy Monte Carlo. Make sure to keep an air sickness bag handy, loser." Jess climbed into her car, slamming the door. "Bye, loser," she said before speeding off. Decisions had been made, actions taken, and life continued. Jess's company began experiencing internal turmoil. Hannah, the CFO, and the general counsel grew increasingly tense as budgets were slashed and layoffs swept through the organization. The ripple effects reached every department, including Jess's, adding strain to her life with Eric. As her pregnancy progressed, Eric became less interested in the process of preparing for the baby. He skipped doctor's appointments and avoided discussions about childcare. Work disruptions affected his travel schedule, and his irritability only grew. Tensions in their apartment reached a boiling point, and the cracks in their seemingly perfect world deepened. Eric's move to their city from New York had not brought the happiness he had envisioned. The adjustment to life in a less glamorous environment strained his patience, and his once prized connections with the upper class began to fade. Meanwhile, Jess's career faced unprecedented turmoil as her company grappled with a legal disaster. The root cause was traced back to their software. It turned out the company they had contracted to develop a critical program had built it using stolen code from another organization. Jess's company, having paid for and co-owned the software, was held equally liable. Worse, they had unknowingly sold modified versions of the program to other clients, deepening their exposure. The stolen software had been in use for years, and no one could pinpoint who was responsible for incorporating the illicit code. The fallout was swift and brutal. Employees at the software company were fired en masse, while Jess's organization faced mounting legal fees. The rightful owner of the code demanded back payments for all profits earned, licensing fees, and punitive fines. After months of litigation, the options boiled down to two unappealing choices: abandon the software entirely or enter into an expensive licensing agreement. Developing a replacement would take years and risk bankruptcy, so Jess's company agreed to a 10-year payment plan with steep initial costs. The financial strain rippled through the organization. Salaries were slashed, commissions vanished, and layoffs became common. The once thriving company felt like a sinking ship. By the time Jess's baby was due, her workplace stress was matched only by the tension at home. She and Eric had grown distant, their relationship reduced to curt exchanges and awkward silences. One evening, Jess returned to their apartment to find most of Eric's belongings gone. He was packing the last of his things into a suitcase. "What are you doing, honey?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I've taken a job on the West Coast," Eric replied casually, as if announcing plans for a weekend trip. Jess's breath caught. "What? When will you be back?" "The baby is due any day now." "I'm not coming back," he said flatly. "You've got health insurance to cover the birth." Tears welled in Jess's eyes. "What about raising our child? Caring for him?" Eric sighed, his tone impatient. "Jess, this isn't for me. I like fine dining, art museums, and vacations in Monte Carlo. I don't do diapers, strollers, or sleepless nights." "Eric," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you loved me. I thought things would go back to normal after the baby came." "I have a plane to catch," he said coldly. "Goodbye, Jess." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Jess sobbing on the couch. Her body trembled as grief and fear overtook her. Suddenly, she felt a sharp pain, followed by a rush of fluid. "Oh my God," she gasped. "My water just broke." Her hands fumbled for her phone. Desperate, she called Sophie, a friend from work. "Sophie, please help me. My water broke, and Eric just left," she cried. "I'm so sorry, Jess," Sophie said apologetically. "I'm 2 hours away at my sister's. Try Grace or Rachel." The line went dead. Jess tried calling Grace, but the call went straight to voicemail. Rachel's phone wasn't accepting messages. Panic gripped her as another contraction hit. She grabbed her hospital bag and stumbled out to her BMW. Climbing into the driver's seat was a struggle, but she managed. She drove less than a mile before the pain made it impossible to continue. It dawned on her that someone else lived nearby, someone who could help. Scrolling through her contacts, she hesitated before pressing the call button. "Hello?" Dan's familiar voice answered. "Oh, thank God. Dan, are you home? Please help me," Jess begged, her voice shaking. "What's going on? And why are you calling me?" Dan asked, his tone laced with confusion. "I'm in my car near Ashton Glen Apartments. It's an emergency. Please come now," she pleaded. Dan hesitated, then sighed. "I don't think you're dying, but I'll head over since you're close." "Thank you," Jess whispered, ending the call as another contraction racked her body. Dan arrived minutes later in a canary yellow Audi. He parked beside her car and walked over, his expression unreadable. Jess rolled down her window, her face pale and strained. "Thanks for coming, Dan," she said between shallow breaths. My water broke. I need to get to the hospital. Where's Eric? Dan asked bluntly. He left. He doesn't want the baby, Jess replied, her voice breaking as tears welled again. Dan stared at her, disbelief etched on his face. He left you while you're in labor? Call him back. He won't come back, she whispered, her sobs growing louder. Dan sighed deeply. All right, give me your phone. I'll call an ambulance. He dialed and relayed her location to the operator. Pregnant woman in labor, sitting in a silver BMW with hazard lights on. Send an ambulance. Handing the phone back, he said, the ambulance will be here soon. Can you drive me? I don't want to ruin my new car, Jess said weakly. Dan glanced at the BMW, then at her. Where'd you get it? Looks expensive. It's from my commissions, Jess muttered. Dan's lips curled into a smirk. Remember the software I wrote for your company? Turns out, my company owns it. Thanks to the licensing fees your company now owes us, I've received a 7-figure payout, and more are on the way. Funny how life works. Jess doubled over as another contraction hit. Dan stepped back, glancing at his watch. The ambulance should be here soon. I've got a date. Good luck, Jess. Dan, please stay until the ambulance arrives. And can you take care of my car? Jess begged. Dan's face hardened. That's a husband's job, or the father's. Neither of which I am. Dan, Jess cried, desperation in her voice. Opening his car door, Dan paused. You know what, Jess? Eric is an idiot, and you're a lying, cheating strumpet. You two deserve each other. With that, he got into his car and drove away, leaving Jess sobbing in pain as the distant sound of sirens grew louder.